Let's be honest. Dad's broke. My son said it at Christmas dinner, laughing, to a table full of my own family, and every one of them laughed with him. They had no idea that 3 days earlier, I had sat in a lawyer's office and rewritten a $2 million trust, and that I'd just decided, listening to them laugh, exactly who was going to be left out of it. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that from the first minute, because this isn't a story about a bitter old man cutting off his family. It's a story about what people show you when they think you have nothing left to give, and how the quietest person at the table is usually the one keeping the most careful score. I'm Walter. I'm 73. And what happened at that Christmas dinner, and what I did in the weeks after, changed my family permanently, but not in the way anybody at that table would have guessed, because the person who inherited that $2 million was sitting right there while they laughed, saying nothing, and not one of them saw it coming, least of all her. Stay with me. This one turns on who was watching the quiet person watch. Let me go back. My wife Margaret and I built our money the boring way. 46 years. I ran a heating and cooling business. Furnaces, ductwork, the unglamorous machinery that keeps people alive through winters they never think about. Margaret kept the books, and Margaret had a gift for turning $1 into $1.10, quietly, year after year, never once telling a soul. By the time we sold the business and Margaret passed, 6 years ago now, cancer, slow and unfair, there was a good deal more than anyone in the family imagined. Around $2 million, held in a trust, plus the house, paid off, worth plenty in a market gone mad, and nobody knew. That was Margaret's doing, and her rule, which I can still hear in her voice across our kitchen table. Walter, the minute they know the number, they stop seeing you and start seeing the number. Let them wonder. You find out who your family really is the day they think you're worth nothing. She was right. She was right about everything, and I spent the last 6 years finding out just how right, one family gathering at a time. Because here's what happened after Margaret died. I got quieter. I dressed plainer. I drove the same old truck I'd driven for 15 years. I didn't pick up checks at restaurants the way I used to when Margaret was alive and we could afford to be generous in the open, because now I was alone, and being alone makes a man careful, and careful looks, to the wrong eyes, like broke. And my family's eyes were the wrong eyes. Let me tell you about them, and I'll try to be fair, because a cartoon teaches you nothing. My son Brian is 50. He does well, or he says he does. Brian has always talked richer than his bank account, and I suspect the gap between the two is what makes him so loud about money. His wife, Denise, keeps a tight ledger of who has what and who owes whom, and somewhere along the way the two of them had quietly filed me under aging liability. Not an asset, a cost, a father who'd need looking after, whose old house would eventually need dealing with, whose care might come out of the inheritance they assumed was coming. My daughter Sharon is 47, and Sharon is different. Not warm exactly, but fair in a distracted way. She's busy, she's tired, she's got her own life pulling at her, and she treats me the way you treat a piece of furniture you're fond of, but don't really look at anymore. And then there was my granddaughter, Sharon's girl, Emily, 24. And Emily is the reason there's a story to tell, so hold on to her, because everyone else at that table forgot she was in the room, and that turned out to be the most important fact of the whole night. For 6 years, Emily was the only one who actually came around, not for holidays, always. She'd stop by on a Tuesday for no reason. She'd fix my coffee the way I like it without asking. She sat with me the first Christmas after Margaret, and didn't fill the silence, just let me be sad next to someone, which is the rarest kindness there is. And she never, not once, asked me for a thing. She had no idea I had money. She thought, Like all of them, that Grandpa was a modest retired furnace man rattling around a paid-off house, and she came anyway. That's the part you have to understand. She was kind to a man she believed had nothing to give her. Now, the inches. Because the broke comment at Christmas didn't come from nowhere. It was the end of a long, slow slide. The first inch was maybe 2 years ago. Brian started making little jokes. "Careful, Dad. Don't spend it all in one place," when I ordered the cheaper thing at dinner. "You need us to spot you, old man." With a laugh, in front of people. Small stuff. The kind of thing you let go once. But I spent 46 years reading rooms full of customers deciding whether to trust me with their money and their winter, and I know the difference between a joke and a positioning statement. Brian was establishing something, out loud, in front of the family. Dad is broke. Dad is a cost, which means whatever we do for Dad later, we're being generous, and whatever comes to us after is earned. The second inch was money itself. About a year ago, Brian came to me, quietly, without Denise, which is how you know a man's ashamed of what he's asking, and he needed a bridge. $40,000 to cover a temporary gap in some business thing, and I want you to notice what I did, because it matters later. I gave it to him. Cash, no drama, no lecture, and I never mentioned it again, not because I forgot, because I was watching to see if he would. He never paid back $1, and more telling, he never brought it up again. Not once. And a few months later he was making the dad's broke jokes louder than ever, to a man who'd just quietly handed him $40,000. That's not forgetting. That's a man who has decided the money he took doesn't count, because it came from someone who doesn't count. The third inch was the brochures. You knew there'd be brochures. Denise ever so helpfully started mentioning communities, for when the house gets to be too much, Walter. Sharon nodded along, distracted. And the picture they were all quietly painting was clear. Dad is declining. Dad is broke. Dad will need managing. And won't it be simplest if he's tucked somewhere and the house gets sold and everyone moves on? And through all of it, every joke, every inch, every brochure, Emily said nothing, because Emily wasn't part of it. Emily just kept showing up on Tuesdays with the coffee. They talked about me like furniture, and they talked about Emily like she wasn't there at all, because a 24-year-old who isn't asking for anything is invisible to people counting an inheritance. I want to tell you about those Tuesdays, because they're the real heart of this, more than any trust or any number, and because I think some of you have an Emily in your life and don't fully see them yet. It started the first winter after Margaret. I was in a bad way. I won't pretend otherwise. A man loses the woman he spent 46 years beside, and the house gets very loud with quiet. And one Tuesday, Emily just showed up. She was 18 then, still in school, and she didn't have a reason, and she didn't announce it as a kindness. She just came in, saw the state of the kitchen, and started making coffee. And she got it wrong the first time, too strong, and I didn't correct her, and the next Tuesday she got it right, because she'd paid attention. That's a small thing, but small things are the only honest things, at the end. Anyone will show up for a funeral. It takes something real to show up on an ordinary Tuesday in February, when nobody's watching, and there's nothing to be gained. She did it for 6 years, through school, through her first job, through a breakup that had her crying at my kitchen table while I made the coffee for once. She'd tell me about her life, and she'd ask about Margaret, really ask, wanting the stories, the only one in the family who still said her grandmother's name out loud. And once, I remember, she looked around the old house and said, "I love it here, Grandpa. It feels like her." And she had no idea, none, that the house she loved because it felt like Margaret was worth more than everything her Uncle Brian pretended to own. She wasn't loving a number. She didn't know there was a number. She was loving the man and the memory, which is the only thing Margaret ever asked anyone to do. There was one Tuesday I think about most. I'd had a hard night, missing Margaret, and I was short with Emily, snapped at her over nothing, the way grief makes you cruel to the safe people. And she didn't flinch and she didn't leave. She just said, "Rough one today, huh?" and poured the coffee and sat down. A lesser person finds a reason not to come back after that. Emily came back the next Tuesday like it never happened. That's when I knew, if I'm honest, long before the trust, long before the Christmas joke, that this girl was different. She loved me on my worst day, believing I had nothing, expecting nothing. You cannot fake 6 years of Tuesdays. Now, 3 days before Christmas, I did something. I went to see my lawyer, a woman named Ruth, who'd handled Margaret's trust and mine for 20 years. And I want to tell you exactly what I did, because it's the hinge, and I promise it pays off. I didn't go in angry, I went in clear. I'd been watching for 6 years, and I'd finally seen enough to know the truth Margaret told me I'd learn. I knew who my family really was. So I rewrote the trust, $2 million plus the house, and I restructured the whole thing around one simple principle, that money should follow the people who showed up when they thought there was nothing to show up for. But I didn't tell a soul. I signed the papers, I shook Ruth's hand, and I drove home in my 15-year-old truck to a house nobody knew was worth anything, carrying a decision nobody knew I'd made. And 2 days later, I went to Christmas dinner. And I sat down at that table at Brian and Denise's house, and I waited to see if anything would happen that might change my mind. I gave them one last chance. That's the part I want the older folks to hear. I sat down genuinely willing to be proven wrong. I was not proven wrong. We got through the meal, and then, over dessert, the conversation drifted to money, the way it always did at Brian's table, and someone mentioned a vacation, and Brian glanced at me with that grin and said it, loud, for the room, a performance. Well, don't look at Dad to chip in. Let's be honest. Dad's broke. Been broke for years. We'll probably end up covering him before it's over. And the table laughed. My son, my daughter-in-law, even Sharon, my own daughter, gave a tired little laugh and looked at her plate, around a table full of people I had fed and raised and, in Brian's case, quietly handed $40,000. The joke landed and everyone laughed. Everyone except one person. Because I looked, the way I'd learned to look, quietly, around the whole room. And Emily wasn't laughing. Emily had gone still, and she was looking at her Uncle Brian, with an expression I'll remember to the day I die. Not shock, not anger. Something worse for them. Disappointment. The clean, quiet disappointment of a young person watching the adults reveal exactly who they are. And then she looked at me, to see if I was hurt. She was the only one at that table who thought to check if the joke had landed on a person who could feel it. And in that moment, I want to tell you, I didn't feel humiliated. I felt certain. Every doubt I'd carried into Ruth's office 3 days earlier, every hope that I was being too harsh, too suspicious, too much the grieving old man reading betrayal into a joke, it all went quiet. Because the room had just shown me, out loud, exactly what Margaret promised it would. And I want to be fair to myself here, because some of you are wondering if I was just a bitter man looking for an excuse. I wasn't. I had genuinely hoped, driving to that dinner, that Brian would do one small thing, mention the $40,000, offer to help me with something, ask a single question about my life that wasn't about what I cost. One gesture, and I'd have gone back to Ruth and rewritten it again, split it fairer, given him the benefit of every doubt. I was not looking for a reason to cut my son out. I was looking, right up to the last minute, for a reason not to. He didn't give me one. He gave me a punchline instead, and a table full of laughter, and the quiet confirmation that in his ledger I had already been written down as broke, as burden, as furniture that would someday need clearing. A man tells you what you're worth to him. You only have to listen. But here is where I thought the story would go, and it's not where it went. I thought I'd say something. Stand up, tell them all the truth, watch their faces change, drop the $2 million fact on that table like a plate, and walk out in triumph. That's the clean ending. That's what the anger wanted. I didn't do it, and I want to tell you why. Because it's the whole point, and then I'll tell you what I did instead, which was better. I didn't announce anything, because Margaret's rule cut both ways. The minute they knew the number, they'd stop showing me who they were. They'd start performing. If I'd told that table I was worth $2 million, every laugh would have turned to warmth in an instant, and I'd never again know which of them meant it. The silence was worth more than the satisfaction, so I let the joke sit. I smiled a small smile, and I said, lightly, "Guess I'd better keep working then," and everyone chuckled and moved on. Relieved the old man could take a joke. And Emily kept watching me. And after dinner, while the others argued about a movie, she came and sat by me and said, quietly, "That wasn't funny, Grandpa. I'm sorry he said that." And I patted her hand and said, "It's all right, sweetheart. People show you who they are. It's a gift, if you're paying attention." And she looked at me for a long moment like she was filing that away, and she was, and I didn't know yet how much that sentence would come to mean. Real life doesn't wrap up like a movie, so let me tell you what actually happened, because it's better than a scene. I never told them, not that Christmas, not the next. I let them keep their version. Broke old Dad, for the rest of the time I had left with them, and it told me everything, right up to the end. Brian kept his distance, except when he needed something. Sharon stayed distracted and fair. And Emily kept coming on Tuesdays, kept fixing the coffee, kept not asking for anything, for years, never knowing. When I passed, and I'm telling you this story from a place where I can, so make of that what you will, the trust did what I'd written it to do. The bulk of it, and the house, went to Emily. $2 million and a paid-off home to a young woman who had been kind to a man she believed had nothing, who had never once counted, who was the only person at that table who thought to check if a joke had hurt me. Brian received exactly the $40,000 he'd borrowed and never repaid, recorded in the trust, to the dollar, with a note that it constituted his full inheritance, the loan settled. Not out of cruelty, out of accuracy. He'd told the family what I was worth to him. I simply agreed with his math. Emily, I'm told, sat in Ruth's office when it was read, and did not understand at first. She thought there'd been a mistake. She kept saying, "But he was broke. Grandpa was broke." And Ruth, who is kind, told her, "No, dear, he was watching. And you were the one who passed." So here's what I'll leave the older ones with tonight, because this one is for us. The ones the family has quietly filed under broke, declining, a cost. The ones being laughed about at the far end of a table we paid for. Let them think you have nothing. It is the truest test there is, and it costs you only your pride, which at our age is a cheap thing to spend. Watch who shows up when there's nothing to gain. Watch who checks if the joke landed on a person, and keep your own careful score, not for revenge, never for revenge, but for accuracy, because the last thing you get to do in this world is decide, truthfully, whose kindness was real. And I'll tell you the thing I most want you to hear, if you're old and tired and starting to feel like a burden to people you'd have died for, that feeling is a lie they gave you. You are not a cost. You are a test that most of them are quietly failing, and one of them, maybe just one, is quietly passing. And that one person, the one who shows up on a Tuesday in February for no reason at all, is worth more than the whole rest of the table combined. Find them, see them, While you still can, let them know, in whatever way you can manage, that you saw them see you. Margaret knew all of this. You find out who your family really is the day they think you're worth nothing. She was never talking about money. She was talking about who loves the man and not the number. I almost stood up and told them all the truth, for the satisfaction of watching their faces. I'm so glad I stayed quiet and let the truth tell itself, later, to the only person who'd earned it. Now, the comments, and I read every one. Was I wrong to leave Brian only what he'd borrowed? Some of you will say a father should forgive his son, should divide it evenly, should give everyone a fresh start. Some of you will say the money followed exactly who deserved it. Tell me. And the harder question, the one worth sitting with, if you knew, right now, that your family thought you were broke, are you certain you'd be happy with who's still showing up? I think most of us are afraid to find out. I think that fear is the whole reason we tell them the number too soon. And if you believe that the quiet ones, the ones who let themselves be underestimated and keep a careful, loving score, are the strongest people in any family, then stay with me, because next time I'll tell you about the son who sold my late wife's piano while I was in the hospital, and the phone call I got 3 days later from the man who bought it. Take care of each other, watch who shows up, and let them think you have nothing.